Earth had once stood tall, its people confident in their achievements. But that was before the Zurak descended from the stars, bringing with them an unstoppable force that shattered every defense. Across the globe, cities that once gleamed with life were reduced to smoldering ruins. Skyscrapers collapsed into dust, monuments to human progress lay in ashes, and the world's finest militaries crumbled. Soldiers, brave and steadfast, fell before the Zurak's advanced weaponry. Tanks, jets, and missiles, Earth's strongest arms, were rendered useless against the precision and power of alien technology. The Zurak weren't just technologically superior. They were genetically engineered warriors, bred for conquest. Their soldiers towered over humans, their bodies enhanced with exoskeletons that made them faster, stronger, and deadlier than any human combatant. Every human attempt at resistance was met with brutal efficiency. The Zurak's weapons tore through the most fortified bunkers like paper, and their machines patrolled the skies, ensuring no one escaped their reach. For every human soldier who rose to fight, 10 were cut down without mercy. Earth had never known a force like this. The Zurak had one goal: total domination. Earth, once free, was now a battlefield, its cities mere husks of what they used to be. From the wreckage of New York to the ruins of Paris, there was no corner of the globe untouched by the alien invasion. At the helm of this conquest was Commander Sun, the ruthless alien warlord responsible for subduing the entire Asian continent. Cold and calculating, Shun had no interest in Earth's culture, history, or people. To him, humanity was nothing more than an obstacle to the expansion of the Zurak Empire. Shun's forces patrolled the streets of every major city under Zurak control, enforcing brutal laws. Human lives were reduced to labor, their existence a means to an end. Across the continents, the stories were the same. Humanity, in its arrogance, had believed it could stand up to the Zurak. But now, the once mighty human race was on its knees. The remaining resistance was scattered, disorganized, and barely surviving in the shadows. Hope seemed a distant memory, a faint flicker in the oppressive darkness of alien occupation. Those who had once fought for freedom now lived in fear of extermination, and the rest accepted the Zurak's rule as inevitable. But far away from the bombed-out cities, hidden in the quiet, mist-covered mountains of rural China, there was one place the Zurak had yet to touch. In this peaceful village, untouched by the chaos of the world outside, a lone man trained in silence. Lei Zhang, a kung fu master who had spent years perfecting his art in the ancient halls of a Shaolin monastery, lived in the quiet solitude of his practice. Tall and lean, his body moved with the fluid grace of one whose every action was a reflection of discipline and focus. The village was simple, and its people humble, far removed from the Wu that had ravaged the world. Lei Zhang had heard of the alien invaders, of course. How could he not? The stories of Earth's fall reached even the most secluded corners. But Lei had not taken up arms. He had not marched to war with the others, nor had he joined the chaotic scramble of those who fled the invaders. For Lei, the world had already become a place of imbalance long before the Zurak arrived. He saw the destruction, the violence, and the greed that had paved the way for Earth's vulnerability. He stayed at the monastery, continuing to train in the old ways, holding on to traditions that had long been forgotten by most. Though quiet and unassuming, Lei was far from ignorant. He knew the world was suffering. He knew the time of peace in his village was borrowed. But while others ran from the coming storm, he found peace in preparation. His connection to Shaolin was deep, an unbroken lineage passed down through centuries. The art of Kung Fu was not just a physical practice to Lei, it was a way of life, a discipline that connected mind, body, and spirit. His movements were a reflection of balance, precision, and purpose. And yet, despite his power, he remained removed from the larger conflict. He believed that his role in the world was to protect those nearest to him, to pass on the ancient wisdom of his ancestors. War was not something he sought, even as it loomed on his doorstep. Then, one fateful day, the sound of approaching ships broke the stillness of the valley. The Zurak had arrived. Their ships, dark and sleek, descended like birds of prey over the village. The Zurak ships hovered ominously above the village, casting long shadows over the valley, as the air filled with a low, rumbling hum. From the moment the first of their black, insect-like vessels landed, chaos erupted. Alien soldiers, towering and armored in sleek exoskeleton suits, poured out of the crafts. Energy weapons gleamed coldly in their hands as they moved with terrifying precision through the narrow streets, breaking down doors and dragging terrified villagers from their homes. Screams echoed as families ran, desperately trying to hide, but there was no escape. The Zurak soldiers, swift and unrelenting, cut through all resistance. Any who stood against them were blasted down by their energy rifles, their bodies crumpling before the alien might. Homes went up in flames, smoke billowing into the sky as the invaders showed no mercy. The village, once a peaceful sanctuary, was becoming a war zone, overrun by the very force that had decimated Earth's greatest cities. Amid the panic, Lei Zhang stood in silence, his eyes narrowing as he observed the scene unfold. From the steps of the monastery, he watched the Zurak wreak havoc on his village, his heart heavy but his mind calm. He had lived his life in balance, choosing not to involve himself in the world's conflicts, believing that peace could be found in patience and wisdom. Yet now, with his people suffering before him, that belief was tested. The teachings of the ancient masters echoed in his mind, principles of stillness, of restraint, but also of protection. Lei felt the pull of duty, the quiet call to act. His fingers flexed as he stood rooted to the spot, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The villagers needed help, and he could no longer simply observe. His resolve hardened. For the first time in years, Lei Zhang would fight, not out of anger or revenge, but out of a deep, quiet obligation to defend those who could not defend themselves. His movements were slow and deliberate as he descended the steps of the monastery, each footfall an embodiment of centuries-old teachings. There was no hesitation in his heart. The time had come. With a deep breath, Lei stepped into the chaos. The first Zurak soldier to notice him turned, its glowing eyes narrowing in confusion at the sight of the lone man approaching without fear. The alien raised its weapon, ready to fire, but before it could squeeze the trigger, Lei moved. His body shifted like water, a blur of motion, closing the distance in an instant. With one fluid strike, his palm found the joint in the alien's exoskeleton, the precise spot where its armor was weakest. The Zurak's arm jerked, the weapon falling from its grasp as it staggered back, disoriented. Lei didn't stop. His body flowed with a grace that defied the brute force of his opponents. Every movement was calculated, every strike purposeful. Where the Zurak relied on strength, Lei countered with agility and precision. One by one they attacked, and one by one he dismantled them with the ancient techniques of Shaolin Kung Fu. He moved like a shadow, always one step ahead, exploiting the gaps in their armor with pinpoint accuracy. The Zurak lunged at him, its massive frame bearing down on Lei with raw power, but he sidestepped effortlessly, redirecting the alien's own momentum and sending it crashing to the ground. Another soldier fired its energy rifle, but Lei spun out of the line of fire, his hand snapping forward to disarm the alien in a single, swift motion. His fist struck the creature's chest with a force that seemed impossible for a man of his size, and the Zurak crumpled to the dirt. The aliens were confused. They had never faced an opponent like this. Their armor, their technology, none of it mattered against Lei's mastery of technique and discipline. They were used to overwhelming their enemies with brute force. But here, against a man who fought with the precision of a master, their strength was their downfall. The battle was short but intense. Lei moved through the field of broken exoskeletons and fallen soldiers like a force of nature, unyielding in his defense of the village. By the time the last Zurak retreated, their ranks in disarray, they left behind a scene of utter disbelief. In the middle of the village square, Lei Zhang stood alone, his breath steady, his fists still clenched but relaxed. The villagers, had hidden in fear, slowly emerged from the shadows, eyes wide with astonishment. They had witnessed something they could barely comprehend, a single man standing against the might of the Zurak and winning. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the quiet aftermath of the battle. But in that silence, something shifted. The Zurak, for all their technological superiority, had faced something they hadn't anticipated: the ancient, unshakable force of human spirit and skill. Word of Lei Zhang's victory spread like wildfire across the war-torn lands. What had once seemed impossible, A single man defeating a group of Zurak soldiers with nothing but his bare hands now became a symbol of hope. Small, scattered groups of humans, long beaten down by the alien occupation, began to stir. Some were survivors of failed rebellions, others were monks and martial artists who had been hiding in remote temples, and a few were just ordinary people who had lost everything. One by one, they sought out Lei, drawn by stories of his incredible strength and discipline. At first, Lei was reluctant. Leadership had never been his goal. He had fought to protect his village, not to start a movement. Solitude and the teachings of his art had always been enough for him. Yet, as more people arrived at his monastery, their faces tired but filled with new determination, he realized he couldn't turn them away. They needed more than just protection. They needed guidance. His initial resistance melted away as he understood the weight of their hopes. The first lesson Lei taught them wasn't about punches or kicks, but about the mind. He explained that Kung Fu was more than just a physical skill. It was about controlling the body through the mind, and ultimately, the spirit. His new students listened intently as he emphasized patience, discipline, and the importance of inner strength. The way to defeat the Zurak wasn't through brute force, but through precision, understanding, and the ability to adapt. With each passing day, the group grew stronger, their movements sharper, their confidence building. Lei's training didn't stop at the monastery. As the group grew, they began to venture out, launching small but carefully coordinated attacks on the alien invaders. Instead of confronting the Zurak head-on, Lei taught his followers to use their environment to their advantage. In the dense forests, they would lie in wait, blending into the trees and shadows until the moment was right to strike. In the mountains, they used the rocky terrain to ambush Zurak patrols, hitting them hard and then vanishing before the aliens could mount a counterattack. The Zurak, heavily reliant on their advanced technology, struggled to adapt. Their soldiers were strong, fast, and heavily armed, but they lacked the fluidity and adaptability that Lei's group demonstrated. The resistance fighters would strike quickly, using the precision of Kung Fu to target the weakest points in the Zurak's exoskeleton. A well-placed strike to a joint, a quick disabling blow to a power source, and the alien soldiers would collapse, their advantage neutralized. The Zurak's energy weapons, while deadly in open conflict, were far less effective in the close quarters of the forests and mountains, where Lei's fighters excelled. What made these attacks more effective was their unpredictability. Lei's group moved like ghosts, appearing from nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. Every ambush eroded the Zurak's confidence, and every victory fueled the growing human resistance. It wasn't long before the Zurak started to take notice. Reports of these primitive humans, who somehow managed to defeat their technologically superior soldiers, began reaching higher levels of the alien command. The victories began to mount. Small patrols were wiped out, supply routes disrupted, and communication lines severed. As more battles were won, more humans joined the cause. Martial artists from distant regions, monks who had once sworn a vow of nonviolence, even survivors of shattered military units. All of them came to Lei's side, eager to learn and fight. With each new ally, Lei's group expanded, its influence spreading like ripples in water. What had started as a small rebellion in one remote village was quickly becoming a movement. Commander Shun, the Zurak warlord overseeing the occupation of Asia, grew increasingly frustrated. This rebellion had been little more than an annoyance at first, but now it was a legitimate threat. Despite his best efforts, the Zurak's superior firepower had proven useless against these guerrilla tactics. Shun's soldiers were trained for large-scale warfare, not for the precise, elusive strikes of Lei's group. He couldn't understand how these humans with their primitive fighting techniques were managing to outmaneuver his forces. The mounting losses forced Shun's hand. He could no longer afford to ignore the rebellion. With growing impatience, he ordered a direct strike on Lei's group, determined to crush the resistance before it spread further. Preparations began for a full-scale assault, with the Zurak gathering their most elite units to wipe out the rebels once and for all. But the more the Zurak pushed, the more resilient the resistance became. Lei's legend had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the monastery. Stories of the kung fu master who could defeat alien soldiers with ease inspired uprisings in other regions. In cities and towns long under Zurach rule, humans began to fight back. No longer willing to live in fear, they found courage in the tales of Lei's victories. The rebellion was no longer just about survival. It was becoming a symbol of Earth's unbreakable spirit. Despite the odds, despite the overwhelming force of the Zurach Empire, humans were rising. And at the center of it all was Lei Zhang, the quiet monk who had become an unlikely leader, guiding his people not just with his fists but with his wisdom. Commander Shun stood at the helm of his warship, eyes narrowed as Earth's landscape passed beneath him. The resistance had become a thorn in his side, a blemish on what should have been an effortless conquest. He had been content to let his soldiers handle the humans, but the persistent victories of this so-called kung fu master had left him no choice. Now he was here to end it personally. Shun's ship descended over the valley, the ground trembling as his elite soldiers deployed. Their armor gleamed in the sunlight, thicker and more advanced than the standard troops, designed specifically to neutralize Lei Zhang and his fighters. The Zurach warlord stepped out, towering over his soldiers, his 6'8" frame clad in a high-tech exoskeleton that made him nearly invincible. His helmet's glowing red visor scanned the battlefield below. He was here to crush the resistance once and for all. Lei Zhang stood still, waiting at the edge of the clearing, his face calm, his breathing slow. Around him, the resistance fighters were scattered, battle-ready, but there was an unspoken understanding that this confrontation was inevitable. Lei knew this would come down to him and Shun. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation as the two leaders locked eyes from a distance. Shun raised a hand, signaling his soldiers to stand down. He had no need for them. This fight was personal now. With slow, deliberate steps, the warlord approached Lei, his armor humming with power. Every movement was mechanical, precise, and filled with barely contained menace. Shun stopped a few feet away, towering over the human who had caused him so much trouble. Without a word, the duel began. The alien warlord struck first, his massive fist crashing down with enough force to shatter the earth. But Lei was ready, his body moving like water as he sidestepped the blow with effortless grace. Shun's fists were fast, his strength immense, but Lei had trained for this moment. He had studied the weaknesses of the Zurach's exoskeletons in his previous fights, and though Shun's armor was more advanced, it still had its vulnerabilities. Shun roared in frustration as Lei ducked and weaved, his movements impossibly quick, always just out of reach. The warlord swung again, but Lei countered, his hand flashing forward in a sharp strike to a joint in Shun's armor. There was a brief spark, and the warlord staggered back, surprised but far from defeated. Lei pressed the advantage, staying close, his strikes precise and deliberate. Where Shun relied on brute force, Lei used his agility and knowledge, exploiting every small opening. But Shun was no ordinary soldier. He adapted quickly, his movements becoming more unpredictable. His mechanical limbs hummed with power, delivering crushing blows that forced Lei to stay on the defensive. Each strike carried the weight of a battering ram, and though Lei dodged most of them, the few that connected sent shockwaves through his body. For a moment, Ted, an alien warlord, with nothing but his bare hands spread across the globe. He had become a living symbol of hope and courage, a testament to the fact that, no matter how advanced the enemy, there was no force greater than the will and spirit of humanity.